if Indonesia continues to do business in terms of their forests in relation to the timber industry and the degradation issues, if they continue to use natural forests for plantations, then Indonesia does not have very long. There's a massive short supply of raw material feeding an industry that's way over capacity on a global level anyway. So I think the crisis that belongs in the Indonesian forests is there for a while.
And what can this government do to get serious about sustainable forest management?
One of the most successful and key policies that has been adopted by the Indonesian government was under the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Programme that was initiated by Europe 5 or 6 years ago. And that was to include all stakeholders in the decision-making process when it was exposed how much Indonesia was destroying its raw material base through illegality. If you don't address the root issue of unsustainable timber practice, which is corruption, then none of the other policies are going to work. Indonesia took a very courageous step actually by walking down that road, because what it meant was stakeholders who are usually not allies in a room together, spending years working out, right down to detail, as to what would be the legal and sustainable approach for the logging of trees. I think there's quite a few actually, and one of the key ones obviously is to ensure that there is a civil society engagement and a dialogue. I think also a lot of the answers lie with civil society, communities, indigenous groups, NGOs. You know, we've been on the ground, we see things, a lot of people live in those forests, they know what they're able and not able to do. That's the first thing. I think also making sure that even the industry that relies so much on these forests is brought in and is not left to the last minute in terms of any dialogue. The Ministry of Forestry has done this in terms of the voluntary partnership agreement that they signed with Europe, but they don't seem to have followed those lessons in any other sectors within the forestry sector. And I think that's a huge mistake. Another really valuable lesson that we learned is that the approach for a voluntary partnership agreement wasn't a top-down approach. It really did come from all sides. So everybody had a stake, everybody had a voice at that table. And it's not easy. It's quite a complicated and can be at times very emotional time, and it takes a long time to do it. But actually, by the time we got to the end, by the time things were signed and agreed to, so much trust had been built up between all of those stakeholders. And we were hoping that this would have been a great lesson for not just Indonesia, but also Europe, in terms of how to address complex forestry issues, including those related to REDD. I think there's lots of roles civil society can play, but in the case of degradation, for example, obviously exposure. Continuous exposure of the corruption and the criminality that's engaged with that. In terms of land grabbing, in terms of laundering and legalizing palm oil plantations, again, civil society is on the ground. It plays a very important role in terms of being a watchdog. The difference between anybody doing that under an REDD initiative versus a VPA initiative now is that one of the crucial aspects of the agreement in the VPA was that civil society actually has a formal role within the monitoring of the VPA. So for example, instead of having to hide under bushes now and risk your life with cameras to film or expose somebody's criminality, we're actually part of the monitoring system. So our information goes through a system exactly as it would for any of the other service providers that are looking at accountability. And I think, you know, that's what's missing in the RED initiative, if you like, is that the role of civil society is kind of, oh yes, of course we must invite them to all of our meetings, but there's no role, there's no formal avenue by which civil society can give the information that they have from the ground. First of all, international trade isn't just about commodities. It isn't just about trade. It's about livelihoods. It's about survival. And I think people really need to remember that. And I think that one of the problems is that sometimes when you've got too much of a good thing, you create a huge surplus. The timber industry has for many, many years been unregulated, and it has actually relied on criminals and illegality in order to make the profits it has. There are good aspects of the timber industry, absolutely, and they've all come on board this. But I think what's very interesting is how within producer countries there is still this notion that they're going to get away with bad chain of custody, with no accountability, no labeling, nobody knows where it comes from. And I think they're in for a shock. The demand side, i.e. Europe, for example, it's taken them a really long time to take responsibility for them driving the whole markets for cheap tropical timber. And finally, again, driven by civil society through their exposures of who was doing what, it became clear how illegally sourced timber was being laundered, if you like, through European markets. This was putting a bad slant on European companies. And for years and years and years, with all those exposures, finally there was this response from both ends, where you have Europe saying, okay, we have to clean the chain of custody, we have to know where this comes from. We need to know where the tree was cut, not where it was manufactured, not what the origin is under WTO, but where it was cut. In the meantime, with producer countries, you need to reform and clean up. You need to enforce. And those are the elements that were great. But to this day, there are still big criminal syndicates that are involved in supplying illegally sourced timber and wood products. The response from the timber industry towards these regulations has been slow, but now they're on board. So there is an opportunity here to try and clean up what is pretty much a dirty trade. As long as those who rely on those forests and the people who live in the forests and those of us who work to protect not just the trees but the biodiversity and the people that live within it, as long as there's still space, political space, for them to be involved and to be part of the decision-making process, then yes. But if you cut them out, if you cut us out, then I'm afraid I don't have a very positive outlook in terms of any of the forests within East Asia.